Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We're your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we are coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg in Schaumburg, Illinois. Now, at Muscle Activation Schaumburg, we believe that your health is your most valuable asset. Your health is one of the biggest influencers of the quality and quantity of time that you have. And while there are many aspects of health, our expertise is exercise. Exercise has been proven time and again to not only improve your health, but also increase your longevity and improve your quality of life. And today, we want to talk to you about some exercise-related issues that we see coming up in the fitness industry, and that's this idea of there being these magic muscles within your body. And we're calling this the magic muscle myth. So we want to talk about this because a lot of times clients come in saying that either they've been told or they've been reading or they've been looking up online regarding different symptoms that they're having, and the information seems to point to like one muscle. It's like the key muscle that for them is going to essentially unlock everything. And once that one muscle gets addressed, everything's going to be so much better. And we see a lot of issues with this.
Yeah, so we're actually going to bring up three really popular ones that we hear a lot about. And those three, which we'll dive into, is the Psoas, or your hip flexors. A lot of times people are told they've got too tight of hip flexors. The Piriformis, which is a really deep hip rotator. It lives underneath of your butt cheek or your glute muscle. And the Rotator Cuff, which is a grouping of muscles that control your glenohumeral joint, which is your shoulder joint. And we just picked these three because they're really common ones, but we're also going to dive into some myths about them. So let's start with the Psoas. The Psoas, again, remember that one was the hip flexor muscle. And the Psoas is really interesting because it's a trunk muscle and a hip muscle. So it actually attaches to your spines in your it attaches it to your vertebrae in your spine, and it attaches down across the hip and onto your femur, which is your top leg bone, your upper leg bone. And the psoas is often a big one to blame for having tight or achy low back and tight hip flexors. And oftentimes this one is brought to light by a lot of people, and they say that the thing we have to blame is that we sit all the time. So that's that one. So we blame the psoas for all the problems related to the tight low back and tight hip flexors from sitting usually. And the piriformis is oftentimes the one that is blamed, the one muscle. Remember, we're talking about this issue because we're talking about one muscle that's being blamed for all these things, is oftentimes blamed for the cause of something called Piriformis Syndrome. And this is like when people get really intense tightness or achiness or pain in like below their butt cheek, like right where the piriformis lives. Sometimes this pain can be related to like a sciatic issue. They start blaming that too. So this Piriformis Syndrome, we take all of our arrows and point it towards the one muscle that we call the piriformis. And the piriformis is responsible for turning your leg out. Again, it lives below your glute. So a lot of times people feel like it's super deep in their butt, somewhere in there. So that's piriformis. And then the last one that we're bringing up is the rotator cuff. A lot of times we misname this one, so maybe you call it the rotator cuff, but we're talking about the same thing. And again, this is 4 muscles that control your shoulder joint. And a lot of times we blame this muscle. This is actually our only one that's a muscle group, but we'll talk about why we group them. We blame this one a lot for shoulder impingement. So if you raise up your arm and you feel some pinchiness in your shoulder, that's what we're talking about. A lot of times, if you go on Google or you ask a friend, they might say, oh, it must be your rotator cuff. That's the problem here. So we're highlighting these because these are common ones that we have a general symptom, right? Like we feel something going on in our bodies, and we decide to blame one muscle. Now, some people in our industry have even taken it on themselves to make some crazy claims about certain muscles. And this is a quote, and I'm not going to share where it's from just in case they're listening. But so this is a little quote that actually one of my clients sent me. And it was one muscle that said, discover the muscle that helps reduce pain, promote weight loss, enhance your strength training, and increase your energy when it's relaxed. And I don't know about you, but when I read that, I was like, really? I mean, we get one muscle relaxed, and it's going to change my whole life. I'm going to have less pain. I'm going to lose all the weight I need to lose because of the relaxation of the muscle, of course. Mm-hmm. I'm going to have better strength training, and I'm going to have more energy. So it's just these very extreme relationships that we create, that this one muscle, that we have different areas. We were just talking about, the psoas, the piriformis, rotator cuff. I think one that we didn't talk about that could also be in here would be tight hamstring. So, there's all these certain one muscles that we blame for a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and this is a big issue because, to be just quite honest, you can't use general symptoms and then from those general symptoms, narrow it down to one specific muscle that across all people is the main issue. You just can't. And we see it too much in our daily practice where general symptoms are just simply an indication that something is going on. It's like a check engine light for your body. Hey, that check engine light comes on, there are some symptoms that come up, but you can't say across all people exactly which one specific muscle is causing these general symptoms, even if the symptoms are the same from one person to the next. So there's a number of issues with that. What we want to dive into, though, are discussing maybe some of the usual ways that these symptoms are addressed. Because a lot of times when people come to us, we are not their first stop. We're not their second stop. We're usually further down the line if they're coming to us for MAT. And so they've been through a lot of other modalities and a lot of other ways of trying to address these symptoms. And so the thing about it is sometimes these other ways take more of a general approach. And what we mean by that is, hey, if something feels tight, then that means it's too tight, and that means we need to relax it. Or if something is weak, that means it's too weak, and that means we need to try to strengthen it. Okay, so a lot of times what we see, going back to the 3 different groups of muscles that we talked about, hey, we need to stretch the hip flexors. We need to stretch out the low back. We really need to kind of stretch out that piriformis we need to really stretch out that psoas muscle and get that psoas muscle calmed way down because it is just way too tight and overactive. Or, that piriformis is just contracting way too much. And so because of that, you got this Piriformis Syndrome going on. So you have to sit on a tennis ball. You have to, do these piriformis stretches to really just try to relax that muscle. Or the rotator cuff muscles are just far too weak. So we need to do these rotator cuff exercises for those muscles. And the challenge is just going off of the symptoms of tight low back, tight hip flexors, Piriformis Syndrome, or shoulder impingement. It's really hard to say what's going on with specific individual muscles unless you start asking more questions and unless you start testing.
Yeah, great point, Charlie, and I like how you brought up the point where when we have a general symptom like a tight hip flexor, a pinching pain in our shoulder, or some tightness in our butt, or the Piriformis Syndrome that we were just talking about, oftentimes what's offered to us are general solutions. And you know what? If you're listening to this today and you had one of these symptoms, and I know a handful of you listening will have had one of these symptoms because they are very, very common, and you did one of the modalities that you found on Google and it worked for you, great. I'm so happy that you are out of discomfort and pain, because who wants to be in discomfort and pain? I don't. But as you guys know, if you've been listening to Charlie and I for a while, or you've been a subscriber of the Exercises Health Podcast, or you follow us on any of our many platforms like Facebook or Instagram, or you know an MAT specialist, maybe it's not us, but you know someone in your area, you probably have picked up that we view the body in a very, very unique and different way. And so we're bringing up these ideas and points, not because we feel like the way you've worked with your body and the way that has worked for your body is wrong, but maybe another solution so that you can view your body in a different way. And also, again, as Charlie said, we see so many people and we're their fifth choice, we're their sixth choice. So we're trying to offer this information so that you can have a better understanding of how we're viewing the body and what we see when we view the body. And really just so that it can be another option, because we find that the way that we work with the body is very opposite, than the normal modalities. So back to what Charlie was saying with when we feel these general symptoms, we use a general modality to get rid of the symptom. And he was mentioning things like if the hip flexors are tight, we should probably loosen them. And a lot of times we think about loosening them with stretching or massage or rolling on a ball or a foam roller or trigger pointing it. Or if we feel tight piriformis, same idea. We just want to loosen that muscle. And then again with rotator cuff, that one's normally blamed for a little bit of weakness in the area. So we're given these exercises that we do over and over and over again, or, before your gym workout or just when you go to physical therapy, whatever the case may be. So we're going to try to offer some ideas of maybe why these general things might not be working for you. If they haven't been working for you, maybe you're still looking for a solution, and maybe some ideas of why MAT really addresses this in such a different way.
So there are a couple questions you have to ask yourself if you're finding that you're experiencing some of these symptoms, okay? And the first is, hey, if you're feeling like muscles are particularly tight or particularly achy, you have to ask yourself, okay, why is that happening? And could that tightness, could that achiness, could that symptom actually be very intentional? Could your body be purposefully overstimulating that muscle for a very specific and intentional reason? And then the second question you have to ask yourself, if you feel like certain muscles are too weak, is are those muscles intentionally being downregulated by your body for a very specific reason? So in other words, instead of just assuming that this symptom is a bad thing and must be addressed by any means necessary, you have to stop and ask yourself, is this symptom intentional? What is it trying to tell me? I mean, let's be honest, a tight psoas is probably not trying to tell you that your psoas is tight. There's probably something more going on there. And so if you're just addressing the symptom, you're probably missing the reason why the symptom is there in the first place.
Charlie, I love what you said, and I want to explain this because when you were saying this, we say this all the time. We say, if you have a tight muscle, is that really a good reason to get rid of it at all means necessary? Because what I think is interesting is that when we try to address a tight muscle in the modalities that we just discussed, a lot of times other areas get compromised that we don't realize. Like when you're stretching your psoas muscle, what else is that affecting? You can't only affect one muscle. You're probably affecting all the other hip flexor muscles. And mind you, if you're stretching one side, you're shortening the other side, for example, your hip extensors. So if you think the front side of your hip has to get longer, then the back side has to get shorter. So is it okay that all your hip extensors, your back side of the muscles are getting shorter? So I just wanted to bring that up when you say, is it worth it to get rid of it at all costs possible? Because there is a cost to getting rid of tight muscles at sometimes.
So when we're talking about this kind of overactive component, why are certain muscles maybe more tight or they feel symptomatic. And an analogy we often use is this idea of walking on ice. Okay, so imagine that it's the middle of January and you're walking along on dry pavement. And you have your normal walking motion, your body's feeling great, and then all of a sudden you step on ice. What does your body do? It immediately tightens up. The moment you step on the ice, your body immediately tightens up. And it tightens up everywhere. It doesn't just tighten up around your feet and ankles. It tightens up everywhere from the base of your skull to the tips of your toes. And your motion gets really short and choppy, and you're not able to move as much or as freely. But then to get rid of that tightness, you don't have to do this like total body relaxation technique. All you have to do is just step off the ice. And once your body realizes that you're not going to slip and fall, the stability of the ground is back in place, it will allow you the motion that you had before you stepped on the ice. It will allow your entire body to relax just by introducing the stability. So the question becomes, well, why did you tighten up in the first place? And you tighten up in the first place intentionally to protect yourself, so you use less motion when you're walking, so you don't slip and fall, and so you're less likely to hurt yourself. So taking this analogy and expanding it into what we might be feeling as far as tight hip flexors, tight low back, a piriformis that might be overactive and creating some kind of piriformis syndrome, we have to ask ourselves, why are these muscles overactive? Could they be overactive because somewhere in my body there's some instability going on? In other words, because other muscles aren't doing their job well. And by getting other muscles working better, that can relieve the workload of these muscles that are feeling tight and achy. And once that workload is relieved, that tightness starts to dissipate, joint motion returns, and you feel strong and stable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that analogy because it really highlights the idea that when you are experiencing an instability, and in that case it was ice, your body has a natural, normal, and protective, very productive response of tightness, limited motion. And we get into that limited motion in the presence of instability because it allows us to survive. It allows us to make it through, even though it's not as comfortable as free big motion. But as soon as we get rid of that instability, the ice, our mobility goes back to normal. We didn't really have to do much to change that. Another analogy that we really like that I think will be a good transition into talking about our weaker muscles is talking about when you're at work with 9 of your colleagues and you guys are preparing for a big event. You have to work on the marketing, you have to work on the content, you got to work on making sure all the attendees are going to be organizing. So there are a lot of avenues going on with this project, and you 10 are just powering through. Let's say one day 5 of the people that are trying to help you with this project don't show up to work. And they actually call in and say, you know what, we're taking the next week off because we're all not feeling good today. We're not coming in. And so now all of the work that was supposed to be distributed amongst the 10 of you are now laid just on the 5 that showed up to work that day. So the 5 that are working, the 5 that are actually trying to get the event going, get the project going, are now overworking. They're having to pick up all the slack that was left from the guys that are sick. They're having to, they're probably overstressed, probably doing way too much than they're supposed to be doing just because we got to get this project done. And a lot of times when we feel areas of our body overworked, we think our first idea is, oh, let's get it relaxed. Let's just relax. But imagine if we took those 5 workers that are actually working and we tell them to relax and take a chill pill and go get massages, and the project would never get done. And that's a big problem. So what we really need to do is send the 5 muscles that are sick to the doctor, get them well again, and bring them back to work so that all the work can be distributed amongst the 10 appropriately, rather than on the 5 and expect that the 5 can overwork and be relaxed at the same time. We see this in the body all the time. We see that there are muscles that are not working well, and there are muscles that are working well. And for example, in the case of the psoas, if we feel like our psoas is really tight, we also have to acknowledge that even though it's really tight, it's got to be working really hard. So the question becomes, is it really working hard because its assisting muscles aren't working well? The other hip flexor muscles might not be working well. So oftentimes we have to go in and look to see, hey, can I get the other hip flexor muscles to come and help out the psoas? And maybe that will bring a little more equilibrium and a little more balance to the situation.
You know, what I really like about that analogy is, if that were to happen in real life where, half your coworkers didn't show up, your boss wouldn't come in and say, "Oh, why are you working so hard?" He'd be saying, "Oh, thank goodness you are here to take up some of the slack for the other people that couldn't make it in today." They might even say, "Hey, I'm sorry, you're going to have to do a little bit more for right now, and then we need to get these other people back in to help you out." It wouldn't be scolding you for doing more of the workload. But yet, with our bodies, when we feel certain muscles tighten up or certain muscles overworking, our mindset is, "Oh, we got to get rid of that muscle working so hard. We need to punish that muscle and make sure that it can't work so hard because every time it does, it feels uncomfortable." As opposed to saying, "Wow," it sounds kind of funny, but wow, thank goodness my psoas is tightening up, because if it wasn't tightening up, my body would be so unstable. What I really need to do is I need to find out what other muscles maybe aren't doing their job so we can get the psoas a little bit of a break.
So what we really want you to take from these two analogies and what Charlie had brought up with the tight muscles and maybe why they're tight, and the weak muscles and maybe why they're weak, is that our bodies do things with intention. Our bodies don't make mistakes. It's not like we wake up one morning and like, "Oops, accidentally we have a tight psoas today. Oopsie doops, gotta make sure you loosen that for us." We have to remember that our body is a machine that does what it needs to do to deal with the environment that it's in. And sometimes that's the internal environment. So what's going on with the muscles? What's going on with the stress and the workload that we're putting on our body? So sometimes, and oftentimes, what we see is that tight muscles are very intentional. Weak muscles are very intentional.
Now, going into the weak muscle discussion, I want to give you another ice analogy. Okay, imagine that you were trying to push your car. Like, let's say your car wasn't starting and you couldn't get a tow truck, so you were going to push it to the mechanics. Okay, you're trying to push this car, and you're trying to push it, and you're on dry pavement. You're pushing as hard as you can. Maybe you can start to get it rolling, and then you're able to push against the dry pavement to help get this car rolling, okay? Imagine, though, you're trying to push this car, but the car is on dry pavement and you are on an ice patch. Like, that would be kind of worst case scenario, right? Because the car is on a higher friction surface. You yourself are on a low friction surface, and so you might be trying to push and push and push and push, but because you can't push against the ground very well because you are on ice, that car doesn't move very well. So what's happening here? In the one scenario, you're able to push the car. In the next scenario, you're not able to push the car. Did your strength change at all? Not really. You physically are just as strong in one scenario as you were in the other scenario, but your output changed. Your ability to use your strength changed. And as soon as you were on an unstable surface, your ability to create as much output drastically reduced because you don't have something to shove back against. You can shove into the car, but because you can't shove back into the ground, your feet are slipping out from under you. And so the end result is your output of moving the car gets immensely downregulated. Well, why is this important? How does this relate to what we're talking about with this rotator cuff issue? A lot of times the rotator cuff muscles get blamed for shoulder impingements. They get blamed for being weak or being lazy, not doing their job, and as such, there are these shoulder impingements that happen. Well, here's the thing. The rotator cuff muscles attach onto your shoulder blade, also known as your scapula, okay? And if your scapula is unstable, meaning if the muscles that were to control your scapula could not stabilize that scapula, now all of a sudden, when your rotator cuff muscles try to pull on your humerus or your arm bone, it's like you trying to push your car while you're standing on ice. Because the scapula is unstable, the rotator cuff muscles don't have something solid to pull against. With you, because you're standing on ice, you don't have something solid to push back against when you're trying to push your car. And so what happens is the output from the rotator cuff muscles can be dramatically diminished because the scapula, the shoulder blade that they're supposed to be pulling on as well, is unstable. And so what happens then is people, when they try to lift their arm up, they start to get these shoulder impingement symptoms. And if you're just focused on trying to strengthen the rotator cuff muscles without actually asking why might they be weak in the first place, you might be reinforcing muscles that are already strong and working well and not addressing the reason why they're not able to access the output or the strength that they have, which is the scapula or the shoulder blade might be too unstable. And so they're trying to push their car while standing on ice.
Right. So again, as what Charlie is highlighting, is that this weakness that we might feel that we have in a shoulder might be intentional due to weakness elsewhere. And we do see this a lot in the shoulder because there's a really unique situation going on in the shoulder where the scapula, it doesn't really have a ball and socket joint like we normally think about. Like, for example, the hip. We think about a bone going into, a socket, and that's how the hip is so stable. The shoulder doesn't have that. The shoulder is completely stabilized. Well, the shoulder blade is completely stabilized by muscles. And so it's really important that if we are feeling some kind of weird symptoms in our shoulder, that we really make sure that the base of the shoulder, the scapula, is able to be stable. So I'm going to have Charlie put this crazy video of me pushing a Costco cart, which is, if you've ever been to Costco, that means your cart is a bit heavier than a normal grocery store cart. But basically, a Costco cart, which is so easy to push inside the store, and the clip is of me trying to push it on ice. Basically, a cart that's generally very easy to push, but without stability on my end, I could be creating all the force and all the pushing and all the pulling that I want, and I was unable to move the cart. So I think that would be funny to put in the blog here.
Okay, so here's the thing. If you have these symptoms of tight muscles, if you have symptoms that might be related to muscles being too weak, you have to ask yourself, why is that the case? Could those things be intentional by the body? Are they something that has to absolutely, by any means necessary, be addressed? Or could it be something else that's going on? What we're trying to suggest is that by assessing for where your body may be unstable and then addressing those instabilities, many of these kind of magic muscle myths really start to dissipate and fall apart. Okay? So what do we commonly see? What do we commonly see with MAT? Because really that's the whole goal of MAT, is to figure out where these instabilities within your body are, and then address those instabilities, and then all the symptoms that are related to the tight muscles, that are related to the seemingly weak muscles, start to go away. Okay? By addressing these instabilities, what kind of things do we see? These tight psoas and tight hip flexors and stuff. A lot of times it's the opposite side muscles, like the hamstrings and the glutes, that are actually a little bit underactive. that are not working as well as they should, and that are creating or contributing to the instability. And so by getting those muscles working better, and by getting those joints and areas of the body more stable, now all of a sudden the hip flexors and the psoas can start to relax, and that starts to dissipate some of the tightness that is experienced in those areas.
Yeah, and then also with the piriformis, this is again another tight muscle. So with the MAT mindset, we go in looking for what muscles are unstable, causing this to be tight and protective of the unstable muscles. So a lot of times with tight piriformis, actually this one I see a couple areas. Again, one of the motions that I see that really helps with piriformis is working on hip external rotation, which is one of the motions that piriformis helps with. So sometimes the piriformis is the only one doing its job, and all the other hip external rotators need to jump in and help. I've also seen hip extension change this symptom, meaning we have to work on your hip extensors, similar to what Charlie said, like glutes and hamstrings. But I've also seen things like hip flexion help with this. So a limit in motion or a limit in strength in hip flexors. So this one I don't find to be just one area, but this one I see a lot of different motions or limitations and weaknesses that can lead to the extra tightness in this area.
Also, the trunk and the feet are strong contributors to this. So that's why it's so hard to say, oh yeah, Piriformis syndrome is a piriformis issue, which means that muscle needs to be released or relaxed or whatever. So often it can be actually somewhere else in the hip, or it might be a completely different area of the body, like the trunk or the feet, that are contributing to this piriformis syndrome. And as far as the rotator cuff muscle group is concerned, some weakness in the rotator cuff, or rather the shoulder impingements, a lot of times by working on muscles like upper traps, like anterior serratus, that can help this shoulder blade, this scapula, become more stabilized. In which case, now all of a sudden, the rotator cuff muscles can start to do their job better because they have a solid surface to pull on when they are trying to contract and move your humerus or your arm bone. So a lot of times with something like rotator cuff issues or like shoulder impingements, looking at the muscles that would help to stabilize the shoulder blade itself, again, the kind of upper traps, anterior serratus, muscles like that can help to bring the stability that's necessary for the scapula, and then allow that area to be better anchored so the rotator cuff muscles can actually do their job.
Actually, I just recently had a client come in with impingement, and would work on his shoulder, 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 and it would get like a little bit better. And then one day I was like, you know what, let's back up and let's work on your trunk, because you had some instabilities in your trunk. And after the first day of work on his trunk, he's like, my shoulder is awesome now. So really it is so difficult to say that because you have a symptom, there's a problem with this muscle, which is really what we brought up as the subject of this this podcast. It is very difficult to take a symptom, which is symptoms are just indicators that something's not right. It doesn't tell you what is not right. We cannot take these symptoms and blame one thing for them, because after that one thing doesn't work, and trust me, the one thing doesn't work for a lot of people, that's when we have to start exploring other areas. And luckily with muscle activation techniques, we've been given a skill set where we're able to assess your entire body and find out where your mechanical instabilities are. And this allows us to make your body much more stable, which a lot of times takes away a lot of these symptoms that are caused from instabilities.
So if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, I've experienced tight hip flexors, or I've experienced some piriformis syndrome, or, I've had some shoulder impingement issues, and, it's maybe gotten better, but it's not at 100%. here are some things you can do. First and foremost, go to muscleactivation.com and click on the Find a Specialist tab. Find an MAT practitioner that's local to your area and connect with them, all right? What they're going to do for you is they're going to assess your body and figure out where these imbalances and where these instabilities are, okay? That's number one. Number two, make sure that you are cleared for regular exercise before you go in. That's kind of so maybe that's number one. Number one, make sure you're cleared for regular exercise. Number two, go check out an MAT practitioner because they're going to help to figure out, again, where these instabilities are and how to go about addressing the instabilities that may be contributing to what you're feeling as tight hip flexors, Piriformis Syndrome, or some shoulder impingement stuff. So again, muscleactivation.com, click on the Find a Specialist tab and find a practitioner that is local to your area. Now, don't just go to anybody, okay? Because here's the thing is a lot of people say, oh yeah, I do muscle activation, or I've done muscle activation if they're a client. And the reality is many people are out there promoting themselves saying that they themselves do muscle activation, but they're not certified or they haven't maintained their certification. So to make sure that you are getting high quality service, make sure that they are listed as certified on the website, on the muscleactivation.com website, before you go and sign up with them, okay? So that's a really, really, really important thing. Well, hey, thank you so much for tuning in. We always appreciate you listening. If you found this information useful or helpful, head on over to iTunes and review it for us, or better yet, share it with somebody that you think needs to hear this content. Next week, we're going to be coming back with an awesome interview with a local doctor that we're really excited about, and I think you're going to be excited to hear what he has to say as well. So in the meantime, we hope you have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.